There has been more and more talk about the irrelevance of academic philosophy to everyday life, and for good reason, because philosophy has become, at least at the university level, a more and more arcane discipline with specialized topics that few people outside of the discipline would be interested in or could understand. It's become an ego stroke where people who know each other will and mutually respect one another's intelligence, will respond back and forth in a little echo chamber. And really, it's forgotten, I don't know, its origins. In the West, philosophy really begins with the Greeks, and the word philosophy, from Greek, the love of wisdom. But really, it has become not philosophy, but philos episteme, the love of knowledge. Nowadays academic philosophers are all about knowing more and more stuff and showing off how intelligent they are. It's really about the preeminence of the ego. And I think I joked at in an earlier post about how if you've ever been to a philosophy conference, you've never seen such big egos, not even on an NBA basketball court. And I really do believe that among team sports, basketball is the most egocentric. And you see this, for example, in the phenomenon of trash talking, where one player will try to get into another's head by saying all sorts of stuff, uh, basically dominating the other person's ego with the sovereignty of their own. But talk about trash talking. You go to a philosophy conference, you have 20-minute long papers that are essentially trash talking, either bashing somebody else or, really that's what it kind of amounts to. Philosophy always builds on itself, so it's like Freud's murder of the father. You gotta kill somebody before you in order to assert your own self. And it's a sad state of affairs that now philosophy is not thought of any longer by the general public as anything important, anything worth studying. Um, I have a couple anecdotes to relate with respect to this. I taught for many years at a community college, and a few years ago, I was going to say a couple, but time flies. A few years ago, there were several students who I actually didn't know, but they were part of this club called Peace and Social Justice. And one of those students was really into philosophy and especially continental thought and wanted to go to SPEP, the Society for Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy. Now, they were looking for someone to drive with them from Chicago to Philadelphia. And there was a general email sent out. And I actually happened to be very familiar with SPEP because as a graduate student, I went to Penn State, where it's a heavily continental program. And I was familiar with many of the people, well, not many, but at least a few of the people who were attending that conference. And I thought it would be a good idea just to catch up. So I went with these students. Um, Most of these students were more interested, I think, in exploring the Occupy movement was going strong at that time, and a lot of them wanted to attend events, Occupy events, in Philadelphia as a kind of change of pace from what was going on in Chicago. This one student was really into the conference, but I think the overall takeaway they got from this was they were really disheartened. Most of them felt very small, I think, by these really difficult topics that were being discussed in language that was probably completely unfamiliar to them. And that's not how it should be. Philosophy should be something that people, any person, without any background or training, can appreciate and understand and think about. And it's wisdom. It's about what's important in life. Um, Another little anecdote. Um, Many years ago, as a graduate student, I attended a conference uh, at Loyola University. And ironically, I think I traveled from Penn State, even though Chicago is my hometown. But at this conference, I have this very clear memory. There was a speaker who I respected his writings because at that time I was really into this French philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas, who was Basically, he's big on ethics, the other, and respecting the other. And there was a philosopher at Loyola named Pepperzak, who was a linguist, Freudian slip. Linguist was my dissertation advisor at Penn State, who was famous for translating famous for a lot of things, but he also translated Totality and Infinity, probably the first of Levinas's most important works. But anyway, Pepperzak at Loyola he gave a little lecture, and at the end of it, it was an undergraduate student, that was Claire, a young woman who asked a question, and it was a very sincere, heartfelt question, but at the same time, it was clear among the professional philosophers there, even the graduate students, that it was a naive question, and the way Pepperzak responded to me, it just really stuck in my mind because it's essentially dismissive, condescending, without being obviously so. Again, I don't think that's what philosophy should be about. It should be the love of wisdom, which is accessible to all human beings. I mentioned the Occupy movement. Just as a side note, I think it's interesting to think of how that fizzled out. Maybe there's going to be a comeback in the form of this discussion in this political cycle about income inequality, the 99% versus the 1%. But to me, while it was happening, it was clear that this wasn't going to be sustainable because our society in the U.S. is way, way too wealthy for people to really care about the poor. Even the poor in the U.S. have a standard of living far beyond anything imaginable to people in the world, say 100 years ago, living relatively comfortable lives. I mean, the oppression, the hard lives that the poor feel like they have in the U.S. is largely a function of being dominated by a wealthy, elite, more psychologically, I think, a society that demeans them as opposed to actual living conditions, where in terms of living conditions, people can live quite comfortably. What do you need? Food, shelter, basic things. That's not what's really at issue. It's about inequality between rich and poor. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of my favorite political philosophers, I'm thinking about his personal life and reflecting how sad it was that he couldn't get along with people. Hume invited him over and thought he was just a strange, morose guy. Rousseau kept having these children by his illiterate companion. I say illiterate because there was a class difference and class issues. A lot of Americans today, especially, I don't think they're fully aware of how operative class issues were in the past throughout the entire world and how important they were. But he kept giving up his children to orphanages, etc. But Rousseau, anyway, back to the point. He says I think it was one of his discourses, maybe the second discourse, could have been the social contract, but he says that there was nothing more important, at least in terms of domestic affairs, for a government to do. Right? I mean, international affairs, you could say the protection of the state, but domestically, there's nothing more important than to ensure that the gap between rich and poor does not become too great, because that is the recipe for social upheaval. And things are coming to a head. Actually, I'm hopeful that they're coming to a head, because again, people are too comfortable to really care. That's why we have such a unjust criminal justice system. Poverty breeds crime, plain and simple. And once people are locked up, no one cares about them anymore. Their families. And that's about it. They have no political voice, and there's no will to do anything about it. No one ever got elected saying we should do something about our prison population. Right? People have lost elections because they weren't hard enough on crime. I remember that Michael Dukakis, George H.W. Bush election, where Dukakis, was lambasted for pardoning somebody who ended up murdering people. I don't even know if the facts are accurate. But the point is that no one cares about criminals, so it's easy to be hard on them. It's a function of our of our social system where the poor are just written off completely. Yeah, I kind of lost my original thread talking about the irrelevance of philosophy because of how it's, you know, no longer about wisdom. It's about showing off your ego, or feeding your ego, really, because it's about the preeminence of the ego. Um, I thought of a little interesting, I don't know, pun, I guess. There's a very important concept in the thought of the Buddha. In Pali, the word is anicca. Usually it's spelled Anicca. I don't really like that spelling because it looks more like Annika, not Sorenstam. Anicca, Anicca, I think is the usual spelling. But the translation is sometimes impermanence, change. It's one of the three signs of being, along with dukkha or suffering. Again, that's the translation I've been most familiar with, but I think misery might capture what dukkha is better. That's another one of the signs of being. And anatta, which means non-self, or the non-existence of self. The point is that these three things you really grasp if you see things, if you view things, if you understand things the right way, which is part of the Noble Eightfold Path. You have to understand things the right way. But that understanding, again, cannot come from theoretical knowledge. And this is a mistake I have made through most of my teaching experience. And I wish I could go back and change that, but I don't know, chances are my students really wouldn't care. But what I've learned recently is that practice is essential for a proper understanding. You cannot get that understanding. You can't make it part of your lived experience, Erlebnis, or Erlebnis, as the Germans say. You can't make it part of your lived experience unless you meditate. And that's what this course has done for me. And I think the world really would be a remarkably better place if everyone meditated to train their bodies to become more rational, to become aware, so that your animal-based, selfish instincts, and not just your animal instincts, as I said before. It's a matter of these deep psychological imprints from childhood, by and large, but also throughout life, that are made, that leads to egoism and selfishness. But anyway, so anicca is a reminder that everything is impermanent. So this holding on to the ego is foolhardy. That's why anatman, or the non-self, follows from anicca. And holding on to the self just leads to misery or dukkha, right? Anyway, back to my pun. I just realized recently that anicca, if you pronounce it like that, really sounds like which is the prefix, or an, on the prefix for not Nietzsche. Nietzsche, the German philosopher, Nietzsche, who is probably the foremost proponent of the ego in philosophy. I think I also mentioned in an earlier post, a kind of capitalist successor to Nietzsche would be Ayn Rand, a favorite among certain libertarians. Rand Paul, that's the guy who I forgot before. And also people on the right, like Paul Ryan. They're economic Nietzscheans. I don't know. Like I said before, for Nietzsche at least, there's something noble about that strength that he ties to the ego. Whereas the objectivists, the Randians, I don't think there's much noble about their egoism. It's all based on how much wealth you have. But regardless, I already talked briefly about this before. I don't want to bore people by being repetitive. The point was, I just recently thought of this little pun. Hey, anicca really means not Nietzsche, and it fits. It's quite appropriate. On that note, I think I'll end it. Thanks. Bye.